Hey, world history students, I hope you're doing well. This is our first lesson for the week, and my goal is to make it less than 40 minutes. I know I've had some pretty long ones lately. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and get into this video. Before we go any further, two quick points that I want to make. Point number one, pretty soon you're going to get an email or a video, I think, from Mr. Packard explaining textbook returns and grading some different grading options that you'll have for the fourth 9 weeks. The only thing I want to talk on really quickly are the textbooks. When you return your textbooks, if you could, just on a scrap sheet of paper, just write something like Mr. Quartz or Mr. Quartz textbook or Mr. Quartz class, and just put it on the, just open up the front cover, put it right there, close the front cover. Just put it right on the inside of the front cover of your textbook. That way we can sort of divide out before we start looking at the actual numbers of the textbooks. It's easier if we know which teacher they're assigned to. I mean, if you don't do it, we'll figure it out. It just will take us a super long time. So please do that. The other thing I want to show, there is uploaded today. There's going to be two things that I have uploaded today other than the lesson. First, I actually have the notes for the Cold War. So these are sort of the bullet point notes of what we would normally study during the Cold War. So you can use these notes to kind of look at when we're going over Korea, the Korean conflict, and the Vietnam War. Today's lesson over the arms race and the space race, that's not really in this bullet point. That's a lesson that I'm kind of doing outside of the traditional notes that we would typically do. So I am going to post our Google slideshow today that has all the different videos and stuff. So that will be posted as well. If you're having a hard time following along with the videos that I post, you'll have these bullet point notes to help you with Korea and Vietnam. And then you'll also have the PowerPoint, or I guess Google Slides is what they're called, the Google Slides for today's lesson. And so anyway, with all that being said, we have our last two lessons this week of the year. Um, we have one more Google Meet left after Tuesday today. So if you can log into our last Google Meet, that'd be great. I'd love to see you and answer any questions you have. Make sure we're on the same page with textbook returns and grading policies and stuff. That would be great. Per your choices and your requests, today's lesson is going to be about the arms race and the space race during the Cold War, which are really interesting. You have nuclear missiles going to the moon, like it's really good stuff. It's awesome. And then our last lesson is going to be about Vietnam, which is a very important struggle, a very important war that occurred that shapes the way that we as Americans view war, even through to this day. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get rolling with the arms race first. So again, we are in the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are the two superpowers left after World War II is over. And they are competing at everything. They are competing in the Olympics. They are competing with economics. They are competing with the military. And they're also going to compete when it comes to weapons, meaning the arms race. And they're going to compete when it comes to space and who is going to be in the first to space and the first to the moon. All right, so some differences and similarities between the arms race and the space race. I'm putting these both into one lesson because there is a decent amount of overlap between the two. Again, the arms race, when you hear the word arms, that means weapons. All right, so like if you usually hear the word arms when we talk about the Constitution and the Second Amendment, your right to bear arms. That doesn't mean you have the right to have physical arms. It means you have the right to have weapons. All right, so the arms race was the weapons race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And obviously the space race is the race to be the first in space, the first to the moon, the first to do all these new things that no one had ever done before in human history. So the similarities between these two races, they both involve competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both of them are going to cause both countries to spend a lot of resources. They both involve the use of advanced rockets. So we'll go into that a little bit later. And they both could give a strategic advantage. If one side was able to gain significant advancement over the other, they would have a significant advantage over their rivals. The differences, the space race is primarily involving putting things up into space, like either satellites or human beings. It is not usually destructive in nature. Now, a lot of accidents happen. People do die. Trying to figure out how to get to space safely takes a lot of sacrifice, but it's not destructive. The arms race again involves technology to utilize the power of the atom to create very big and dangerous, deadly weapons to make something that is more powerful than your adversary. And again, the arms race is also going to use technology to find ways to take these new nuclear weapons. And when I say deliver them, that means actually send these armed warheads, find ways to take these armed weapons and drop them on your enemy without your enemy being able to stop you. So we're going to start off with a little bit of a video about the nuclear bomb and and this is how many nuclear missiles we have today. And we have fewer missiles today than we did during the Cold War at times. So just to give you an idea of I don't know, it's almost, I don't like using the word insanity, but there's a level of insanity with the amount of nuclear weapons that we have in our world today.
Many of our viewers have asked us a very serious question. What if we made a big pile of bombs and exploded every nuclear weapon in the world all at once? Strangely enough, we couldn't find a good source to answer this question to our satisfaction. So, we gathered together a few scientists to calculate what would happen and find an answer to this extremely important scientific problem once and for all. Currently, there are 15,000 nuclear weapons on Earth. The US and Russia both have around 7,000, while France, China, the UK, Pakistan, India, Israel and North Korea own around 1,000 between them. But how much destructive power is this really? Let's try to put these numbers into perspective. On Earth, there are about 4,500 cities or urban areas with at least 100,000 inhabitants. Some are bigger than others, so we'll assume that on average we need 3 nuclear bombs to completely wipe out one city. This means we could destroy every single city on planet Earth with our nuclear arsenal, killing more than 3 billion people, roughly half of humanity, in an instant. And we'd still have 1,500 nuclear weapons left. Now that's what an expert would call overkill. So we can say with confidence that we have a lot of nuclear weapons and they can do a lot of damage. But what if we make a huge pile of all 15,000 bombs and pull the trigger? Let's drop our nuclear pile in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, just to show nature who's boss. Our warheads, piled haphazardly, fit into a small warehouse. A typical US warhead has the power of 200,000 tons of TNT. So 15,000 warheads would be the equivalent of 3 billion tons of TNT. For scale, this is enough to rebuild the whole island of Manhattan with every building and skyscraper using stacks of TNT. The closest thing we can compare to the energy gathered here is a volcano. One of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in recorded history took place in 1883 on the island of Krakatoa. The eruption was so powerful that 70% of the island and the surrounding archipelago was destroyed, killing tens of thousands of people. Its effects were felt around the world for days after the event. Our nuclear pile contains 15 times the energy of the Krakatoa volcanic eruption. So let's finally push the button. 3, 2, 1. In a second, a fireball 50 kilometers across vaporizes everything in its way and creates a blast wave that flattens 3,000 square kilometers of forest. Every living thing within 250 kilometers will start to burn. The explosion will be heard literally around the world as the pressure wave circles the Earth tens of times over the next few weeks. Millions of tons of incinerated material are catapulted into the atmosphere. The mushroom cloud reaches the outer reaches of the stratosphere, pushing up against space itself. After things have calmed down, a small crater, about 10 kilometers across, is left in the center of the worst wildfires the planet has seen in millennia, spreading throughout South America, burning down forests and cities alike. And now, the unpleasant part begins. Extremely radioactive material will kill living things very quickly, and a large area several kilometers around the crater is now uninhabitable, as is everywhere for hundreds of kilometers downwind. Much of the fallout is carried high into the atmosphere by the mushroom cloud and carried around the planet. The amount of radioactive material in the environment doubles worldwide, which still isn't civilization ending, but we may see more cancer for a while. A portion of the particles will float at the edge of space for years and cause a nuclear winter that could lower global temperatures by a few degrees for a few years. This explosion was pretty bad if you're in South America and especially Brazil. The Amazon rainforest is pretty.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to stop it off there. And so again, that's just if you exploded every nuclear weapon that we have today. Today. During the Cold War, we had more nuclear weapons than we have today. So it's nuts to think about that, the level of destruction. And we don't think about it a lot because we don't worry about nuclear war anymore like we used to. So anyway, let's go ahead. We're going to sort of figure out why did we make so many freaking nuclear weapons? What the heck? You know, it's so odd, but we'll explain it. And it kind of makes sense, but at the same token, it doesn't. All right, so uh, the first thing to start off with when we talk about the arms race, the nuclear arms race in particular, and why it pays to be the good guys. All right. So at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States are sort of dividing up the world. They're defeating the Nazis, defeating the Japanese together. And pretty much we know, though, by the end of World War II that these two great nations aren't going to see eye to eye. As we are conquering or not necessarily conquering, but as we are defeating the Nazis and the Nazis and the Japanese, they have to decide, do they want to surrender to the Americans or to the Soviet Union? And there are going to be a lot of really, really smart German scientists in particular who go out of their way to make sure to surrender to the United States and not to the Soviet Union. The reason is, and likewise, Japan, depending on which historians you read, they chose to surrender to the United States because they don't want to be occupied by the Soviet Union. And that's because we were seen as the good guys. The United States, by even our enemies, when they had to pick between the Soviet Union and the United States, when given the choice, they wanted to surrender to us because we, in general, um, we didn't torture people. You know, we did do some bad things. All right, we weren't angels. War is war, but the Soviet Union, particularly under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, was seen as a pretty terrible place to be captured and become a prisoner in. And this is why a lot of times students always wonder why do we waste why do we bother being good guys? You know, when all these terrorists, you know, they do bad things, they cut people's heads off. Why don't we do that back to them? And here is the answer. If you act as a good guy, it pays to uphold your ethical standards even during war. Do not stoop to the level of your enemy. We are able to gain a little bit of advantage over the Soviet Union technologically, a little bit, because German scientists worked very hard to fall into our hands and not fall into Soviet hands. All right, so here we have it. The United States, as you know, we are going to create the first nuclear weapon. We dropped actually two of them on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But the Soviet Union, they have a lot of spies and they have their own very good scientists as well. They're able to create atomic weapons very quickly, much more quickly than we thought they could. As soon as the Soviet Union creates some nuclear bombs of their own, we begin to live in fear of each other. We get worried that the Soviet Union are going to have a lot of nuclear weapons that they can drop on us to essentially eliminate our military. The Soviet Union is worried that we have all these bombs that we can drop on them and eliminate their military. So we want to make sure that we have enough nuclear weapons that if our enemies attack us first, we have enough buildup that they know we can attack them back. All right, it sounds kind of odd, but it's the idea that we need to have enough nuclear weapons so that if the Soviet Union tries to blow us up, they can't blow up every single one of our nukes, and we'll be able to blow them up back. And we want to make sure that our nuclear weapons are so big and so powerful, even if we don't necessarily hit a city at the dead target we want, or a military installation at the dead target that we want, if it's big enough and bad enough, it'll blow up cities. So we're trying to create the biggest and the most nuclear weapons. And again, we call this idea MAD. MAD is an acronym, MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. The idea is that if we have enough nuclear weapons, no one will attack us because we know if they do, or they know if they do, we have enough nuclear weapons to blow them up back. And the Soviet Union, same thing. They had enough nuclear weapons to make sure that we as Americans wouldn't attack them because we knew if we did, they had enough nuclear weapons that they would be able to attack us back and blow us up too. So we were mutually assured to destroy each other. So the idea of having all these nuclear weapons, in theory, was to make sure that there was peace. And just to give you, I really like this video. This is going to be I'm not going to play the whole thing. This is going to be the longest video I show today, but it really shows the scale of devastation that we were looking at during the Cold War. And technically, we still are looking at it. These missiles still exist. And in theory, this could still happen, this idea of a big nuclear war.
There are currently over 7 billion people alive today. Humans are dying at less than half the rate we're being born. About 2 die every second, which is 60 million deaths a year. And the difference between the birth rate and the death rate tells us how fast the world's population is growing. We're gaining about 2.5 people per second, or 83 million a year. And as for those who are no longer living, the Population Reference Bureau came up with 108 billion for the total number of humans who have ever lived and died on Earth. They used 50,000 years ago as the start date for Homo sapiens. Now let's arrange the sand into groups of 1 million people. 7 billion is 7,000 millions. And then arrange the living by their age. Doing so creates what's called a population pyramid, though it's usually shown the other way around and separated by gender. We'll want to keep the oldest sand on the bottom. We'll arrange the dead based on how long ago they died. The spike in deaths during World War II is visible even at this scale. Because it all happened in just 6 years, no other war we know of could leave such a dramatic scar on our living record. No war so far. A nuclear war, especially one that erupted late in the Cold War, could have been much worse. You can pause to explore the stories behind these so-called close calls. Some were closer than others, but it's hard to know how close we came or how many people would have died. One way to study World War III casualties is to first look at what atomic weapons did to people in Japan in 1945, and then scale up. About a third of the population of both cities were killed. 90% of deaths occurred within the first 3 weeks. While long-term effects of radiation, such as cancer, killed thousands across decades, it accounted for a small portion of the victims. And on the other end, only a minority of those who died were killed instantly from the blast. Most deaths occurred between the first few hours and the first few weeks due to burns, blast injuries, collapsed structures, and radiation sickness. A broad term that describes a whole array of terrible symptoms, and a slow killer. Even those with high exposure didn't die for 5 to 6 days.
Those are rough images.
The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were small by today's standards. The hydrogen bombs developed years later have 10 times the radius of destruction.
All right, so here in a second, they're going to show all the known targets during the Cold War. We know some documents from the Soviet Union. We have our own documents that have been unsealed that show all the different targets that were planned on being hit if a nuclear war ever happened.
But it's not the size of the bombs that makes calculating World War III deaths so daunting. It's the number of warheads in play.
Right in here is Ashland, Ohio, guys. And look at all the nuclear explosions that would have been happening around us in World War III. A lot of our missile silos are located in this area. That's why I have so many dots.
The death count for the first 3 weeks of a nuclear war would depend on how many warheads launched and how many successfully hit their targets. If we went with a round number on the high end, let's look at what 500 million deaths would look like. Almost 10 World War IIs in 3 weeks. Then something would have occurred that didn't happen in Japan. Because the bombs would have been so much larger, and because many would have targeted underground missile silos, scientists believe the explosions would have propelled enough dust and ash into the atmosphere to block out much of the Earth's sunlight. The radioactive fallout would have been deadly for a week or two, but the darkness and freezing temperatures could have decimated agriculture and food supplies for many years. We won't even see at a guess at what a nuclear winter or nuclear famine would have done to the world's population. With so much uncertainty, most scientists won't even throw out a number.
So again, I'm gonna this video, if you want to watch more of it, it's on the Google slideshow that I shared with you. I really find interesting that spike in deaths in World War II. But then look at this line right here. Absolutely unthinkable. The psychological impact, like right now we have the coronavirus going on, and it is psychologically it's doing a lot of damage to us, whether you realize it or not. Our anxieties are through the roof, depression is through the roof, because we don't know. There's this invisible enemy that at any point you think could infect you perhaps. And even though you have especially as a young person, you have like a 99% chance of surviving coronavirus if you get it, I think. Maybe a little less than that, but it's pretty insignificant. The odds of surviving a nuclear war are like very small. And that's the fear that people lived with throughout the entire Cold War. I lived at the end of the Cold War, and let me tell you, we didn't think about it, but it was always there. The idea that, there could be a nuclear explosion and that's it. So it's such an interesting phenomenon. And so what's going to happen is the United States and the Soviet Union, they built up this missile capacity enough to just essentially almost annihilate the world's population. Now, it wouldn't have annihilated the entire population, but we would have set humanity back maybe centuries had a big World War III actually happened. There is going to be one event that particularly pushes us to the brink of nuclear annihilation, and that is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to play about a 3 or 4 minute video that explains the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's important to understand this crisis. President John F. Kennedy is the president during this crisis. He was only president for a little more than 2 years, but some people consider him one of the greatest presidents in American history, partly because of what happens here.
Any given moment, you and everyone you know could be wiped out without warning at the push of a button. This was the reality for millions of people during the 45-year period after World War II, now known as the Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22nd, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal of the missiles, Cuba and the USSR insisted they were only defensive. And as the weapons continued to be armed, the U.S. prepared for a possible invasion. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile. The same day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a small depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub, too deep to communicate with the surface, thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. That decision had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer both authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. His decision saved the day, and perhaps the world. But the crisis wasn't over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military set itself to DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one step away from nuclear war. With hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to launch, the metaphorical doomsday clock stood at 1 minute to midnight. But diplomacy carried on. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After intense negotiation, they reached the following proposal. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy and promise to never invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Once the meeting had concluded, Dobrynin cabled Moscow, saying time is of the essence and we shouldn't miss the chance. And at 9 a.m. the next day, a message arrived from Khrushchev announcing the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was now over. While criticized at the time by their respective governments for bargaining with the enemy, contemporary historical analysis shows great admiration for Kennedy and Khrushchev's ability to diplomatically solve the crisis. But the disturbing lesson was that a slight communication error or split-second decision by a commander could have thwarted all their efforts, as it nearly did, if not for Vasily Arkhipov's courageous choice. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.
All right, so again, really, we came so close to nuclear annihilation in 1962 over the Cuban Missile Crisis. And President Kennedy had a lot of military commanders telling him, we need to invade Cuba, we need to attack Cuba, we need to get those missiles out. They didn't realize that those missiles were already active, and had we actually tried to invade, they probably would have launched those missiles, and we would have then launched missiles back, and World War III would have happened. Likewise, you had the second in command of that Soviet submarine that was the only person that stood between essentially us and nuclear annihilation. Had that submarine launched a nuclear torpedo, and you know, um, launched a big mushroom cloud would have appeared, um, destroying some American ships, and we would have responded in kind, and meaning that we would have launched nuclear weapons, and before you know it, nuclear war. We were so close to nuclear war, and it's really scary, especially when you see the level of destruction nuclear war would bring. Um, so just to show you eventually what ends up happening, this is sort of a timeline of the arms race. So we have the first atomic bomb, then the Soviet Union makes bombs. So the red bullet points are when the Soviet Union has some sort of an advancement. A blue bullet point is when the United States has an advancement. And you can see that we just sort of keep getting more and more and more advanced all the way up through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then all of a sudden after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we start to see some of these green points on this timeline. What ends up happening after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we kind of take a step back. Now, there's going to be ups and downs between the Soviet Union and the United States after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we kind of take a step back from the brink and we start to actually have more talks of disarmament. And I'm not going to go into all the detail that sometimes we would go into, but here is a list that I took straight from Wikipedia, shame on me, but here is a list that shows all the different disarmament agreements that the United States and the Soviet Union, and sometimes some other nations as well, signed on to limit the types and numbers of nuclear weapons that we had created. Also, we put an end to testing nuclear weapons with some of these different agreements. So all the way back in 1963, we have the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits the testing of nuclear weapons except for underground. And after that, we kind of keep getting paring back our nuclear arsenal. And I'm not going to play this video for sake of time. You can watch it if you want. But essentially, we try our best to create systems that keep a nuclear war from happening, but we keep our nuclear arsenals because we don't trust our enemies. We don't trust the Soviet Union. They don't trust us. So we pare back our arsenals to an extent, but we still have tons of nuclear weapons. And there are 3 or 4 times in history that we even came as close to nuclear war as we did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. At one point, a Soviet Union satellite thought that there were missiles that we had launched, and so the Soviet Union told their missile commander to launch their missiles, and the Soviet Union commander said, "No, what I'm seeing doesn't make any sense. This is just showing that I'm getting 5 missiles launching at me. It doesn't make sense. America wouldn't just launch 5 missiles." And he refused. And again, you have the Soviet Union, another Soviet officer that is able to stop World War III from happening. He had orders to fire, and he said, "No, this is not making sense." And what happened is the Soviet satellite, just the sun reflected off of some clouds, and the Soviet satellite thought that they were missiles. We came close to nuclear annihilation because of clouds. It's just, and that's just one example. So anyway, that's the nuclear arms race. That's why we have so many nuclear weapons. And fortunately, the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union fell apart, and we aren't really threatening each other with nuclear missiles. North Korea is trying to make nuclear missiles. But we don't really have that huge, massive human annihilation threat anymore, even though the weapons are still around. So it is kind of scary. So moving on to the space race. Um, so while the nuclear arms race is going on, simultaneously there's also a space race. The same technology that's being used to deliver nuclear warheads on our enemies is also being used to put satellites and people into space. And why? Why are we competing to go into space? Well, first, it's to push the envelope of technology and exploration, but much of what was being developed for space travel also had military purposes. Likewise, at some point, we have signed treaties not to use space for weaponry, but at one point, there was the idea is if we could put, missile launchers in space, it'd be easy to shoot our enemies from space. So could we use it as a weapons platform? Eventually, we do put satellites into space to spy on other countries, but also eventually we use satellites for everyday business and commercial use. You need satellites for your cell phones to work right. So our current way of life depends on satellites, and that depends all the way back to the space race. And also, it's the competition of the Cold War. We wanted to be better than the Soviet Union, and they wanted to be better than us, and that included with technology and science and space. So in the United States, to go into space, we have still a government agency called NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, and that is the government agency that is responsible for non-military space flight. What we call someone who goes into space, we call them an astronaut. This is just some vocabulary. And in general, during the Cold War, astronauts were seen as these heroic men. Now, eventually later, women are allowed to be astronauts, but during the Cold War, it's primarily men, men who had combat experience flying jet planes primarily. NASA was able to organize and focus America's resources very effectively during the Cold War. The Soviet Union did not have a NASA. All right, and when you hear the word cosmonaut, a cosmonaut is essentially what we call a Soviet astronaut. So a cosmonaut is a name given to a Soviet person going into space. The space program in the Soviet Union was primarily a military project. It was dominated by military agencies. We have what is called a civilian project, meaning NASA is led by civilians. There are military veterans who do, work in NASA, but it's not a military agency. And because the Soviet Union's space program was much more of a military agency, there was a lot more bureaucracy and infighting, so it ends up becoming an inefficient space program. But what's interesting is after World War II, the Soviet Union focuses a lot of resources on making big and effective and rockets. They saw the idea that rockets, they thought that would be a way, if they could get an advantage in making efficient rockets, they could narrow the technology gap that they had with the United States. And on October 4th, 1957, before we are able to do it, the Soviet Union develops a rocket capable of putting a small satellite into space. That satellite was called Sputnik. And essentially, this is a very technical term. Sputnik is going to freak America out. Americans wake up on October 4th, 1957, and realize the Soviet Union put a satellite into space. And this is, nowadays, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but back then, that's like putting something up there. The idea of putting something into space was completely new. It was a novel concept. All right, and so here's a little bit of a video about just how kind of terrified Americans were because of this Sputnik satellite. All the satellite did was make a little beeping noise. It really wasn't like a spy satellite or sophisticated.
Sputnik was the first man-made thing that ever floated above our heads in outer space. It didn't do anything but send out innocent radio beeps. But Sputnik was earth-shattering. Not only because it was the first man-made thing in space, but because of the rocket that got it there, and what that rocket meant.
The Soviets said the kind of rockets which have taken Sputnik up could also carry nuclear weapons in space. They were using Sputnik to try to scare the United States, to scare Americans into the idea that we were all in danger of some Soviet nuclear weapon coming from space.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
Sputnik was the 9/11 of our day. People were shocked that Russia had a technology that could do this, and we didn't.
America said, now wait a minute. Russians can't even build a refrigerator. What are they doing putting a Sputnik, a satellite, into orbit?
We were convinced as Americans that we were the dominant power in the world. We had to be. So the idea that our arch enemy, the evil Soviet Empire, could beat us by getting into space first was just devastating. I mean, people were walking around saying, how can this happen? You know, U.S. is number one. What is this?
This is the Soviet Union's first man-made Earth satellite, on display at the USSR Industrial Exhibition in Moscow.
Ever since the news of Sputnik flashed around the world, America has been asking questions. What went wrong? How did a nation of backward peasants forge so dramatically ahead of us in the race to space?
It gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this. And we fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
And so again, you see America really freaks out. Not only because there's that satellite in space, which really didn't do anything, but the idea is that the Russians now have advanced rocket technology, missile technology. If they can put a satellite into space, they can use that same rocket to put a nuclear warhead on the top of it and then deliver that to the heartland of the United States of America. And so we undertake, after 1957, we undergo a significant change in our American policy. We start to spend lots of money on science and technology in public schools because we feel as though we're falling behind with science and math and technology. In 1960, John F. Kennedy is going to be elected president. Again, this is 2 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis that we just studied. And I'm going to play this speech for you. It is a beautiful speech. And I really, really, really miss this version of America. But he lays out a goal that he has, which is to put a man on the moon, that we are going to overcome the Soviet Union, and we are going to make the 1960s our American decade, essentially. So let's watch this.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. We shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
So anyway, love that speech. The history where he condenses human history into 50 years, but then at the end we choose to go to the moon and do the other things in this decade, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. So President Kennedy lays down the gauntlet in 1960, essentially saying, we need to overtake the Soviet Union. We need to be the first to the moon. They've beaten us to space. They're going to beat us putting a man into space. So after Kennedy's pledge, NASA is going to begin a program called the Apollo program. It's a decade-long research and development program with the ultimate goal of safely landing and returning Americans to and from the moon. The Apollo program is going to launch over 17 missions. Now, they only launches 17 Apollo missions, but there are other missions that they have as well. Of those 17, only seven of them were planned attempts to land on the moon. And on July 20th, 1969, essentially, it's actually going to be about 8 years after the famous moon speech there, Apollo 11 will be the first successful mission, which results in a moon landing, and then those men that land on the moon are able to return safely. And this is essentially sort of the height of the space race, or really it's the end of the space race. Neil Armstrong is the leader of that mission, and he is the first man to walk on the face of the moon. And I'm not going to show a whole lot, but I do want to show some footage. It was a huge deal, and it still is. Like, if we needed to put a man on the moon right now, we would not be able to do it. It would take us a long time to be able to do this again. It's still a big deal today. This was back in 1969.
That the whole world stopped. This man set out on the adventure to escape from his own planet and to set foot on a distant one.
Hello there, Earthling. Hello there. 11, Houston, if that's not the Earth, we're in trouble.
The lunar module cutting itself free from the command module, beginning the maneuvers which should place it on the surface of the moon.
Roger, Eagle, contact. Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings. Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing. 30 feet, 2.5 down. We're drifting to the right a little. 30 seconds.
Oh, jeez.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
We're home.
Man on the moon.
Boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
There he is. There's a foot coming down the step.
I'm at the foot of the ladder.
Armstrong is on the moon.
Yeah,
Neil
step off the
Armstrong,
limb now.
38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, for thousands of years now, it's been man's dream to walk on the moon. Right now, after seeing it happen, knowing that it happened, it still seems like a dream.
So anyway, now that's famous news journalist Walter Cronkite. Just an amazing experience. I wasn't alive during it. Obviously, I wasn't alive in the 60s. But when we think of American exceptionalism, that's the type of stuff that we think about. America getting to the moon and just overcoming a lot of these different odds. Some other missions of note from the Apollo program. If you're not familiar, there's a wonderful movie. I won't show the trailer of it. I did have it queued up, but this video is going long enough. You can watch it if you want. Apollo 13 was a mission that was also supposed to land on the moon, and it suffered, I call it a serious setback. There's actually an explosion on the ship, like out in space, which is nuts. And I'm kind of giving you a spoiler, unfortunately, for if you've never seen the movie. Everyone does make it back, but it's a miracle. Like it's against a lot of odds. I highly recommend watching Apollo 13. There were a lot of sacrifices. What we call Apollo 1. There is a simulation that was happening at NASA headquarters, and they got their oxygen levels wrong. There was a spark in the cabin, and there was essentially an explosion, a big fire that killed 3 astronauts. This one is also sort of a famous thing that you should know as an Ohioan. Mercury 7 was a mission. It's not technically a part of the Apollo program, but it's going to be in the like 60, 61. And John Glenn, a famous Ohio veteran and astronaut, is going to become the first American to completely orbit the Earth in space. It's important to know he ends up becoming a senator from the Ohio for a very long time. Very famous Ohioan. Was sort of, I feel like I need to mention him too. So essentially, in 1969, we land a man on the moon. By 1969, the Soviet Union space program had fallen well behind. Again, like I had said earlier, their government bureaucracy prevented the necessary planning to pull off a moon landing. And the Soviet Union decides to scrap any plans it had to even put a person on the moon. The Soviet Union is going to deny that there was ever a space race. They're going to say, oh no, we never even wanted to go to the moon. Oh no, that was just you silly Americans. We never wanted that. If we wanted to, we would have gotten there first, which is complete garbledygook. They actually had created moon landing vessels that just weren't going to work, and they decided not to even try it. The United States is the actual only country that has ever landed a person on the moon. After 1972, the Apollo program starts to wane off, and we haven't sent really a person to the moon, I don't think, since 72. It's because it's just not very cost effective. It takes a lot of people, a lot of money and resources to go to the moon. You don't get a ton from it. We got a lot out of technology growth from making these moon missions, but the actual landing on the moon, it's not like you're getting, mining gold or anything up there. So even though America is the only country to ever put a person on the moon, multiple countries have landed other things on the moon, though, like China has, Russia has, I think France has. So anyway, And then finally, the space race essentially is over in 1969. We land on the moon, the United States wins the space race. The Soviet Union just can't compete with the resource allocation of the capitalist United States. In 1970s, what ends up happening is that there's an overall thawing in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States and the Soviet Union, they sort of the two space programs kind of work hand in hand a little bit to have a what we call the handshake in space. It's the Apollo-Soyuz mission. The Soyuz is the type of shuttle that was used, the Soviets used to go to the moon. And what I'm showing here, this is a famous picture, an Apollo American spacecraft and a Soviet spacecraft were able to join up together. And then a cosmonaut and an astronaut are shaking hands. Again, it's the first joint US-USSR space flight, 1975. And here's sort of a picture years later or a little bit after this took place of the American astronauts and the Soviet cosmonauts who took place in this joint venture. And so the space race, which for a long time was a symbol of animosity and competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, in the 70s it becomes a symbol of peace. Then in the 80s we get back into competition again. The Soviet Union, it sort of focuses then on creates the first space station in the 70s, pieces of which we still have in the International Space Station. The United States, though, is going to instead focus on what we call the space shuttle. From the 80s up until around 2011, we use the space shuttle to be able to put things in space more rapidly and be able to land space shuttles for multiple uses. Unfortunately, with the space shuttle, we had two significant tragedies: the Space Shuttle Challenger, Space Shuttle Discovery. Just to reiterate, space flight is not safe. It's very dangerous, and both of these crews lost their lives in the space shuttles as they were either taking off in the case of the Challenger or coming back to Earth in reentry in the case of the Discovery. And there you have, again, that's the arms race and the space race. They're kind of similar. They're both examples of the Soviet Union and the United States competing against each other. After things get a little bit out of hand, the two enemies kind of have to work together in both circumstances. In the arms race, we work together to limit the chance of a nuclear war after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the space race, we eventually use the space race as a symbol of peace and friendship and camaraderie in the 70s. And they're both just really, really interesting. One has to do with nuclear annihilation. The other one's putting a man on the moon. Like, really cool stuff. So anyway, if you want to watch any of those full videos, I am sharing this Google slide. You can sort of go on to it, click on anything that you want. And I have a super simple assignment where I just want you to identify a couple things you found interesting about either the arms race or the space race, and in a short paragraph, tell me about them. All right, and that's really it. Hope you're having a good day. I look forward to seeing you in our Google Meets, and we have one more lesson after this about Vietnam, and I will talk to you later. Bye.